Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Reverend Michael Coren. Now, Michael is, well, he's an English guy, but he's living in Canada, and you'll notice by his dog collar or by me telling you, if you're listening on the podcast, that he's ordained into the Canadian Anglican Church. Mike is an esteemed author. He's published numerous books over many years, and he's recently published his new book, The Rebel Christ, which we'll talk about in a moment. Mike is the first guest who's appeared twice on the Godcast in this session that we're going to talk about today, particularly around same-sex relationships. So, Mike, it's brilliant to welcome you to the Godcast. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, it's and I'm very flattered to be only the second person. My golly, that's it's like Saturday Night Live, that club of people have hosted more than once. So, and I'm very well, actually. Weather's changing a bit in Canada, not as cold as it was.
Yeah.
By the way, it's not always cold. We have very hot summers. Our summers, you have to have air conditioning. You're talking about the late high 80s, low 90s. So it's not always cold here.
Yeah. Do you miss the English weather, all the seasons in the UK?
I do, actually, and I miss England. I'm 64 now. I've been here most of my life. I've been here 35 years, but I get more homesick and nostalgic the older I get. Strange.
Really? Yeah. Well, let's get down to the business in hand, Mike. There's a lot in the media and obviously with the news from General Synod about blessing of same-sex relationships, although that's a loosely term that we can use, but we'll come to that. You're a really fascinating guest to have on the Godcast to talk about this, because you come from a place where once upon a time you had significantly more conservative views than you have now. Just take us to that time, Mike. What was it like in that world for you, and why did you hold that particular view?
Well, I was Roman Catholic until about 10 years ago, and this is in no way to criticize Catholics or the Catholic Church. My wife's Catholic, and there are many wonderful Catholics. Canada's about 42% Catholic. It's a very Catholic country. Most of our prime ministers are Catholic, and well, for example, those Catholic prime ministers, Justin Trudeau, Paul Martin, a very serious Catholic, he introduced legislation in this country to legalize equal marriage. So there are many Catholics who don't agree with the Church's teaching, but the Church's teaching is pretty harsh, even though Pope Francis made some more softening, gentle comments about the situation. But I was, because I had a certain public profile, I was seen as a spokesperson on issues where Catholic teaching met the political and public sphere, and that was generally issues of sexuality and abortion and so on. So I argued, not immoderately, I argued for civil union, for legislation to protect gay couples in terms of employment and housing and discrimination. But I said marriage itself was uniquely confined to one man and one woman. So I made those arguments that did convince some people. And because of that, I did more harm. Did more harm than, say, some fundamentalist who just goes on TV to scream about Adam and Eve and Adam and Steve. And those people are easily ignored, discounted. Their views, and also on certain issues, I wasn't conservative. I opposed the Iraq war, against the death penalty, supportive of the welfare state. So it sort of didn't confuse people, but it made it easy. Well, he's actually very progressive on some issues, but on this, maybe we should listen to him. So I did a lot of harm. And then
what harm, Mike, when you say you did a lot of harm, was that to the church or was that to people as individuals? Can you just
no, to gay people? I did a lot of good. Giving the Catholic argument, I think I did a lot of good in that way. But when I changed my views, long story, but I eventually have had this experience in conversion, and I think it was quite spiritual too. And I began to change my views, and then change more and more. And in the last 10 years, I met so many people in the gay community, gay Christians in particular, but just gay people in general. And I know how much pain I cause and how much harm, because they would see this person. One guy, he's very well known in Canada as a comic, a very gifted man. And he wrote to me after all this had happened, and he said, I used to hate you. He said, I hated you because you wrote so well, and you wrote a piece about your father when he died that moved me to tears. And I thought, how can this man, who seems to have this compassion and a certain ability, how can you have these views about me and my partner is gay? And but I've met so many who've told me that, and it's been one of the joys of my life that I've managed to change. And changing your mind, it's not just saying, oh, I've changed my mind. If you've caused harm, I think that in Christian terms, I think that there has to be obvious contrition. I think a certain penalty, a certain penance, and I paid that because, I mean, golly, the way I was attacked and all my work was taken away from me. There'd be campaigns to have me fired from, and it wasn't just the Christian press. It was a conservative. I mean, I'm not going to name the magazine, but a fairly well-known magazine in Britain on the right, the intelligent right, they just said, you can't write for us anymore because of your views. I mean, it's happened. And it's interesting how a lot of the people on the right talk about cancel culture. It does exist. And there are people on the left who are very intolerant, but my golly, there are people on the right who are just as bad, if not worse. And they've been playing that game for years. So I changed my views, and gradually I would make this known publicly because I newspaper columns and on TV. And what would happen then is that people in the gay community and more progressive Christians too would write to me and say, wow, thank you, and let's talk about this. And at the same time, people on the right were writing the most appalling, abusive things to me. And they were trolling my children as well. It got nothing to do with my kids. Mm. One of the things it's very interesting because they had to try and understand or justify why I changed my view. So, it's because one of his kids is gay. We have 4 children. Now, as it happens, they're all straight. Sorry and all that, but our 4 kids are all straight. And it wouldn't matter if they weren't, because there is nothing invalid about changing your mind through the experience of a loved one. People say, well, this person changed their view because their child is gay. Yeah, so what? Mm. So your love leads you to look at something anew. That's very beautiful. But in my case, that wasn't, but they went after our daughters in particular. And I saw that world of homophobia. I was a bit naive. For someone who prides himself on being worldly, I was a bit naive. I thought everyone who opposed, not everyone, but most people in the Christian world who opposed equal marriage were actually not bad people. But on this view, they simply had concluded this was what Scripture taught. And indeed, I know people, as I'm sure you do, who are wonderful people, wonderful Christian people, but they simply can't embrace equal marriage. But that's the minority. My experience, which is pretty broad now on this, the vast majority of people I've met who oppose equal marriage, they're not loving, kind people who on this issue simply can't make the change. There's something deeper going on. And golly, I mean, over the years, we're talking about thousands of emails and calls, and it just goes on and on. But the vast majority, it wasn't even theological. They tried to disguise it as theology, or in their own subconsciously, there was a veneer of theology, but it was really just their visceral feelings. And you know what? It's very interesting. It was invariably about men, and it was often involving sex itself. It was never love. Never love. It was always, do you know what these people do? And I want to write back and say, yeah, I've got a rough idea, But I don't want to get into that in detail, but even that's a misunderstanding. But it was just, you could tell there was a fear and a hatred, and even the Anglican world, God bless it, you just think, why are we spending so much time on an issue that Jesus never mentions? The Old Testament hardly mentions, and when it does, it's in conjunction with all sorts of things that we believe to be archaic and irrelevant. And when St. Paul writes about it, he's quite clearly not talking about loving, consenting relationships, but something entirely different. But we go on and on about that. Us to move on. Okay.
We just lost Mike there with a Wi-Fi break. But Mike, I want to ask you about, I'm just want to just challenge you on what people maybe on the more conservative side, when you now say that you just made those theological references, but once upon a time that wasn't your thinking. You were in support of those I want to ask you, where was the change? Was the change through academic research? Was the change through wisdom of life? Was the change through the hurt that you described that you gave to others? Did that make you think that maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here? What was it specifically?
That's a very good question, because the scripture came later. It was a couple of incidents that occurred in Canada, well, actually in North America. One of them was World Vision, which is a big organization over here, particularly in the States. And they issued a letter that anyone who was in a same-sex relationship was welcome to work for them. And obviously it wasn't without context. There are gay people in relationships working for World Vision, and they just wanted to make these people feel comfortable. They do wonderful work. And they issued this letter. And it shocked me, because I thought, well, that seems very reasonable. But within hours of it happening, not even days, within hours of this letter, and World Vision is big, you had all these major evangelical organizations saying, well, if that's your view, then we have to reconsider our partnership with you, which is really shorthand for saying we won't give you any more money, which means that kids starving in the developing world will die because you have said that gay people are welcome to work for you. And I thought, this is terrible. I mean, this is awful. And it wasn't just the Franklin Grahams of the world. This is fairly mainstream evangelical churches. And then something else that happened, very similar time frame, actually. And it was our foreign minister at the time, Uganda, which is really ground zero for homophobia in Africa for historical reasons. They were considering even more homophobic legislation, which could have led to gay people being certainly arrested, even executed, just for being gay. And our foreign minister, who had, although a gay man, had been very supportive of conservative Christians, actually. He was conservative, very right-wing in many ways. He said to a Ugandan politician at a Commonwealth meeting, he said, if you pass this legislation, you may be expelled from the Commonwealth, because what you're saying is, and it goes against all the principles. So I, naive old me, I thought, this is a good opportunity for Christians and the gay community to come together to say, look, we may have differing views, but we can stand in unity opposed to what Uganda is doing. And I said this on TV and I wrote about it. And there was a storm of hatred thrown at me by conservative Christians. And at that point, I invited one of their leaders onto my TV show. I used to have a TV show. And I'll never forget this, because it was quite chilling. I said to her, you cannot support the idea of someone being arrested, maybe even executed because they're born gay. And she said, it would be unwise. It would be unwise. And I looked at her, what am I dealing with here? And it was a very difficult time for me, poor me, but it was a difficult time because it wasn't a breakdown, but it almost, I was unraveling. How can I hold to these views and be a Christian? And so then I began to explore. I'd always read the Bible, but I really began to explore from not even queer theology, just, I think, a different point. It's as though suddenly you get your eyes tested and you get a new pair of glasses and you realize, I really couldn't see that world, could I? You don't know it because you think that's just what vision is like. And things began to look different. And I met with various gay Christians. I read all sorts of people, and not radical, just through their life experience. So it was a combination. And as you say, it was prayer, it was scripture, it was life experience, meeting various people. And then the beauty that I saw, people who had stayed in the church as gay men and women, who stayed in churches that often had treated them terribly. And I thought that you are remarkable. You really are.
I think that as well. I mean, there are gay people who I know working in the church, and I have the utmost respect that they do that. Mike, I want to ask you about something that troubles me about this people who hold a very conservative position, whether you think it is it is the result of indoctrination. This is what you have to believe, and the consequences of you not believing this, or somebody like yourself who stepped away from a particular position, is the eschatology. The escape plan is only one place you are going. It troubles me quite a lot, and I don't think it gets talked about an awful lot. But I want to challenge people with a conservative mindset, saying what you have been told to believe doesn't necessarily have to be what you believe. You've got a beautiful mind that's been given, a God-given talent that's being given to you. I want you to explore that yourselves. Am I misguided in that? I just wondered what your thoughts were.
No, I think it's very perceptive. And if the Gospels tell us anything, if Jesus tells us anything, it is you have to challenge yourself to an incredibly uncomfortable degree. I mean, the idea that an occupying Roman soldier taps you on the side of the leg, and that means you have to carry his bag, say, 500 yards. And this man says to you, carry 1,000 instead. What? Everything I am, everything about me hates these people, and you want me to do that? And it's turning the world upside down. It's such a radical departure. It's so disturbing. I mean, that's what the Gospels are. It's not the status quo. I don't get into party politics on this, but they're certainly not conservative in any way. They're challenging us in everything we do. And people have been brought up to have certain views about sexuality. Many of them have changed. It wasn't that long ago that divorce, my parents, God bless them, they would whisper things. They would say, I think they're living together. Now, this was only in what we're talking about here, the 60s, the early 70s. That's what they would whisper it, as though, living together, not married. Well, it's not an issue anymore. Until 1930, the Anglican Church was opposed to contraception. It's not Bible-based, actually. When we're accused of being cafeteria Christians, we pick and choose. I'd say the opposite is the case, because if you really are authentic to the teachings, then you should be involved in a very different struggle. But yeah, there is this idea. It's become a litmus test for our faith. When I was cancelled by all sorts of people, they didn't say to me, do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God, and by a personal relationship with him, we're saved? They would say, do you believe that gay people can be married? Well, where did this become the test of my faith? And so it's actually heretical. It's heretical. I don't use that term very often, but it's a form of heresy to reduce Christianity to this question of where do you stand on this issue? And it's an issue of love. So you should say, I stand with love, which is the teaching of Jesus.
Absolutely. And another thing that troubles me is this is, where if this is the conservative view, where is the line in the sand wall? Where is it pitched? So I suppose these people who would argue against same-sex relationships would also make the same argument about matters such as sex before marriage. And I struggle with that from my own perspective. Somebody who didn't come to faith till he was 40, who was been living over the brush, as might be termed in Burnley, who had children out of wedlock, but also in the context of where I am in a very urban setting. I tease some of my friends saying, you'll struggle to find a virgin in Burnley, which is not the truth. But the environment that we are is, we have a lot of people who are living together, who have been through various different relationships. This romantic notion that that they're all going to save themselves till marriage is a little bit extravagant and a bit difficult for me to get my head around. I just wonder what you thought about that, Mike.
Well, it always has been. I had my family tree traced, my mum's side, and the person who did it said, I should let you know that your uncle was born quite clearly, Dave and Bertha, living in Whitechapel in the East End of London, had not been saving themselves for marriage. And they lived about 3 doors away from each other. Very poor Whitechapel in the 1920s, I suppose, and early 30s. And so at that point, they got married, because then you did. boy, Dave, I'm pregnant. All right, get married then. So that's what you did. But I just don't see these as being major issues. It's how you treat people. I mean, a friend of mine, when he went for one of the interviews to be ordained, and they said, "You're gay," and he said, "It's one of the things I am." Well, our sex, our sexuality, it's one of the things we are. It's not the most defining factor. We are many, and we're made by God, complex and nuanced, and again, it's very reductive to say this is all that you are. And I mean, there are people on the left who do this too, and I disagree with that, but that's not where the argument is. And we have to be realistic and practical, and it's not about finding perfection, it's about improving. And we do that gradually. And as I get older, I reflect more on the way I've behaved over the years. And sometimes I sit there and I just sort of cringe in guilt for the things I've done. And it's generally been how I've treated people. It's not about my sex life, as boring as that is. It's really how I've treated people. It hasn't been that bad, but I've failed many times over the years. But it's also very convenient for people to judge others about their sexuality, because they can say, well, I'm not like that. Because for most people, for a straight person, I'm okay, I'm straight. No, you're not okay. You might be straight. That doesn't mean you're okay or not. How do you treat people? How loving are you? How sacrificial are you? How do you change the world? How do you try and lead a Christian life? But years ago, politicians, whenever they were running for office, and they would say so-and-so is married with, and it was really code for saying they were straight. And I remember Peter Tatchell, who I've met, who I think is an extraordinary man. I remember when he ran, this is years ago now, for the Labour Party, and the level of homophobia thrown at him, but also by people in the Labour Party, people on the left, but mainly not. We've changed radically over the years. We can change more and more. And look, I think it's inevitable. I mean, those people who say, well, we're in the majority in the church, we oppose this. You're not in the majority, but even if you were, that's not going to last. I guarantee you, in Africa too, generationally, and new people, younger people simply don't hold to those views anymore, because they're not rooted in theology. They're rooted in culture. I could say they're rooted in prejudice, but if I'm being kind about it, I'll say they're rooted in culture. Every culture. I think homophobia, discrimination has been rooted in all modern cultures to one extent or another, but people are moving on.
Yeah. And something I want to ask Mike is, because I mean, we're as we record this, we're barely a week on the other side of General Synod, and if you took your theological kind of future landscape from Twitter, it would appear that everybody in a conservative position is kind of ready to pack up their bags and move on and move away from the Anglican Church. I'm interested to know if you do feel that the decision that's taken in the Church of England to bless and affirm a covenanted friendship, I think is the official term, whatever that means, has serious ramifications for the rest of the world, how has it landed in the communion, in the Anglican communion in Canada, for example, Mike? Is there concerns? Is there hope? What is it?
Well, in Canada, we've been very Canadian about it. So we've sort of compromised. And one synod, all three houses voted with a sufficient majority to marry same-sex couples, but it had to be ratified by a second one. And we fell short by just a handful of votes. But what we've done really, and it did upset some conservatives, is to decide on a local level. So my diocese, Niagara, which is just west of Toronto, I think you'd be very pushed to find a church that wouldn't marry a same-sex couple. I don't know of any. There may be some. We have about 90 parishes, I think, 90. I don't know of any that wouldn't. In Toronto, there would be, I can think of one or two, maybe 3 or 4 more that wouldn't. But that's reasonable. You leave it up to that. There would always be a church very close by where a gay couple could find a place to be married. The issue, of course, is the international communion. And I think we're divided over that. I think there are many people, particularly in leadership, who want that communion to continue, and I fully understand that. And others who would say, why does it matter? But because we've had this for a few years now, and the States have had it longer, I don't think it's made that much of an impression. I mean, I would say, and you're quite right not to gauge things by Twitter, but I would say that I don't really think it matters at this point what we do. I think there are churches that will leave. And I can see that GAFCON and the Conservatives are already saying, well, this has gone too far now, because they don't want compromise. They want triumph. And I do fear that whatever is said at this point, some churches will leave the communion. Yeah. And I regret that. But I mean, at what point do you say, well, this is what we believe? And I'm sorry, if you're going to react in that way, we're not going to force you to do things, but surely you have to allow us. You know what it is. It's one thing for Canada and the US and Scotland and Wales to do things. For the mother church, for the Church of England to change would send shock throughout parts of the world. And where there's huge growth and there are many Anglicans, and it will be a great tragedy to lose those churches from the communion. But there has to be a stage where you say truth is truth and love is love.
Yeah. One of my concerns, Mike, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, is what I see as the devastating impact this has on the overall mission of the church. It's just kind of, for every couple of steps you try and make, calling out matters of social injustice which are passionate to my heart, there's somebody kind of knocking you back with her horror story and a personal expression of disgrace or distrust in the church for wanting to bless a same-sex union. I mean, I wonder whether the church can withstand anything, but actually, what significant contribution does this have to the death of the Anglican communion in the church, particularly in the Church of England?
Well, I think it goes beyond the Church of England. I think it's enormously damaging to Christendom. And we see it particularly so over here in the US. Yeah, there are certain revivals and there's certain growth, but a lot of younger people are simply walking away because, and I mentioned younger people a few times, but it's very important because we'll be gone. And you have another generation with different views, and they see Christianity being interchangeable with arch conservatism, not just around this issue, and they simply don't want it. So they walk away. And what always we're chatting about this, it's so wonderful. I'll get letters or emails usually from people who read my book and say, so I can be progressive and socialistic and so on and still be a Christian. I didn't know that. They did not know this. And I will always say, not only can you, I think you should be. I don't say you can't be, actually, to be a follower of Jesus. But yeah, it's not the culture that is defeating Christianity. I'm afraid very often it's Christians who are defeating Christianity. And we both meet the most wonderful Christians all the time, but they're not the ones who make the media. It's people who are very much on the right. Yeah. And the US, in Canada, because it bleeds over here, we're nowhere near as bad, but the US, it's a major problem. You're talking about, the numbers there, particularly in the evangelical world, but even on the Catholic right too, they're substantial. And we have an issue here outside of Toronto where a big mega church is in enormous trouble because of personal scandal. And won't go into details, but it's worrying. And people have said, you see, this is what destroys churches. Well, you know what? Yeah, it does to a degree, but there's a bigger issue than just someone going terribly wrong. It's what are you really preaching and teaching? And when you do, years ago, I'm not that old, about 7 years ago, we have our Socialist Party here has a think tank, and they asked me to speak at their conference on the social gospel. And I walked in, and the room was packed. And the person before me, I mean, God forgive me, but I thought it was a bit of a caricature of someone on the left. It was sort of, I'm so guilty for being here. And it just wasn't my sort of thing. I'm an Essex boy, and I cannot be bothered with that. Anyway, and she was going on about how guilty she was because of who she, and I thought, I shouldn't be here. This is not going to be good. And I just let them have it for 40 minutes about the teachings of Jesus. And at the end, everyone stood up and clapped. It was one of those wow moments in my life. These were people on the front end. It was in Alberta, Western Canada, fighting against conservatism on the left, the socialist left, and they just loved what I had to say. That there are so many people eager, hungry for Christianity, but we have to remind them, tell them, for the first time, it's not just a cover for being conservative on issues of marriage and reproductive rights and war, and it's not. That's the very opposite of that. And when you tell them that, it's not that everyone is searching for faith, but a lot of people do have a bit of a gap in their life. And I mentioned to you, I won't say the name, but just today, a very not well known so much, but an author anyway, very gifted. And she said to me, I'm very interested in Christianity, but I can't leave my politics behind. And I think, great, because I can really assure her now she doesn't have to. But when people read once again, what's the big issue in the Anglican Church? All that wonderful publicity that the Church of England received about supporting refugees and opposing the hard right nonsense about throwing people out. And I was so proud of the church. Then a few weeks later, it's in the newspapers, on TV, on radio, because of the debate about equal marriage. And back.
It is so frustrating. I was in we have a place called Farm Foods, which is a low budget freezer centre, and it was just one of those mornings. I just wanted to get something for the kids for their tea, and I encountered 4 or 5 different people in there who I knew, and the conversation was very rich and interesting. But I thought, you've got to meet people where they are, and our church is not an exclusive members club for the middle class, which I sometimes think it feels that way. Mike, we've had a great discussion. I just want to finish with a couple of things. First is there a way out of this mess? Is there a way forward where we can hold it all together, or is a split inevitable? And secondly, I want you to plug your book. I can't see it on your bookshelf there. Is it?
No, it's downstairs. And so when people can see it when they come into the house, this is my study at the top of the house.
So tell us about your thoughts about if there is an end game to this, and also just give an opportunity about your book. I guess your book is full of all this rich stuff that we've been talking about, but just a chance to tell people about it.
Well, I'm not an expert and I can't predict the future. I have to say I'm not optimistic about the communion staying together internationally. And that does, that's painful. And I know bishops, wonderful people. And when they meet with bishops from abroad, they're so enthusiastic. And when they met in Canterbury recently, they were so. I know my bishop, she said, it was just marvelous meeting people with such different experiences. And it is worth preserving. It is, but I don't know if it can be preserved. Because even now you can see the compromised position of the English church doesn't appear to be compromised to many other churches. They think it's selling out. So how do you hold that together? I don't know if you can. I hope we can. Look, I hope Spurs win the European Cup this year, but I'm not going to put money on it. And I don't know, but I have to say I would be surprised if we had this conversation in 10 years, 5 years, the communion was still intact the way it is now. As for the book, it's called The Rebel Christ, and there's only 50,000 words, and it's really just addressing those hot button issues like equal marriage, LGBTQ equality, reproductive rights, economic justice, things like that. And it did very well over here and in North America. And then published. It came out in Britain at the end of last year, and I suppose what it is, I'd like it to be a handbook for those Christians who are more on the left but want arguments. So a lot of it is scripture, and a lot of personal stories and anecdotes, and also just discussion, but there's scriptural backing as well. So this is the way I feel, and here's something which will tell me, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a scholar, I'm just a journalist, a priest, but it gives those arguments from scripture. So I hope for Christians it empowers them, but also for people outside of the church who are interested in Christianity, but they wonder about some of the teachings, to realize this is where we actually stand. And it's readable. I mean, as I say, I'm a journalist. I'm not, it's not a work of theology. We have more than enough works of theology. So it's approachable and accessible, I hope.
Yeah, well, I'm an advocate of more practical theology. I think people need the experience. I think people are likely to change a mind or a view from an experience that they read or learn about. So, yeah.
And the language of communication, because Jesus doesn't speak in I read some of the older languages, and this is a pretty straightforward language. And some of the Gospels, it's a very basic Greek too. It's not that we have to be basic in our language, but I find sometimes people write as though they don't want to be understood by most people. And verbosity and being esoteric. Why are you doing that? I mean, just good, clean language. I don't, by clean, I mean clear language, crisp. Some of the greatest writers, the ability to communicate, it should be at the very center of writing a book, of journalism. But there seem to be some people, particularly in theological areas, who want to be as obscure as possible. I think that's pointless.
Yeah. Mike, it's been lovely talking to you. I'll make sure that there's for people who are listening or watching who might like to look at your book. I'll put the link on both sites. But thanks for coming on, Mike. It's a difficult subject. It's sad in many ways that we have this big schism and divide, because, like you said, some of the people who hold these views are wonderful Christian people. Just hold radically different views to people like yourself and I. And if there's a way forward, then I suppose we can only pray that God reveals that to us in the coming of time. I hope Spurs win the European Cup, but not as much as I hope Burnley win the Championship and playing Spurs next year. And it'd be lovely maybe if we can get to a game together next time you're over in the UK.
I'd love that. And I'm always over during the season because I don't come in the summer, and Burnley will win the Championship. And I think the Spurs might just make the semi-final if the draw's good, but no more than that.
Okay. Well, we send our love to you from England. I know it's your homeland and you clearly miss it very much, but thanks so much for coming on the Godcast again, Mike, and we'll catch up soon.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.